Loving God, by your Spirit, open our minds, that as the scriptures are read and your word is proclaimed, we may be led into your truth and taught your will. Amen. Today's scripture reading comes from the book of Exodus. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, "I must turn aside and look at this great sight, and see why the bush is not burned up." When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called out to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Here I am." Then God said, "Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" God said, "I will be with you." So eventually, Moses and his brother Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go so that they may celebrate a festival to me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should heed him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has revealed himself to us. Let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness to sacrifice to the Lord our God, or he will fall upon us with pestilence or sword." But the king of Egypt said to them, "Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their work? Get to your labors. They are more numerous than the people of the land, and yet you want them to stop working." That same day, Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters of the people, as well as their supervisors, "You shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks as before. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. But you shall require of them the same quantity of bricks as they have made previously. Do not diminish it, for they are lazy. This is why they cry, 'Let us go and offer sacrifice to our God.' Let heavier work be laid on them. Then they will labor at it and pay no attention to deceptive words." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. I have no idea who first coined the phrase prophetic spirituality, but it captures something crucial about what it means to be a committed follower of Jesus. Now, when I use the word prophetic, I'm not referring to someone who has a supernatural power to look into the future and forecast it in precise detail. And the use of the word spirituality has nothing to do with astrology or channeling or New Age thinking. Prophetic spirituality is deeply rooted in Scripture. The word prophetic refers to the Old Testament prophets and Jesus, each of whom served as a mouthpiece for God. Prophets taught how God expects us to live, and they warned of dire consequences if people fail to treat others the way they want to be treated. The prophets expressed God's compassion for those who suffer, God's anger at injustice, God's demand for truth, and God's longing for peace. The word spirituality is a slippery term. It gets bandied around in numerous ways, and it's really difficult to nail down with precision. It has to do with a focus on God, especially through worship, prayer, scripture, and reflecting on the divine. To repeat what I said last week, to say that our faith is prophetic is to say that it's actively engaged in resisting evil, righting wrongs, and spreading love. To say that our faith is spiritual is to say that it's grounded in worship, prayer, and the message of God. My hope is that over the weeks of this series, we'll be able to capture a rich, full meaning of prophetic spirituality, and by embracing it, we'll be able to go to a whole new level in our relationship with God. Moses. Today our focus is Moses and the story of how God called him to liberate the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt. But first, remember when Moses was born. The Pharaoh had become paranoid about the growing Hebrew population. Out of fear, he ordered the midwives to kill all the Hebrew babies born to these women. The midwives resisted and refused the order. When Moses was born, his mother nursed him for 3 months. But then she began to get afraid that he would be taken from her and killed, and so she placed him in a basket at the edge of the Nile, near where the Pharaoh's daughter often bathed. Sure enough, the Pharaoh's daughter found the basket, and she took little Moses as her own. Well, with that, Moses won the lottery, because Moses grew up in the Pharaoh's household, and that meant he lacked for nothing. However, as the little prince grew older, he witnessed this enormous gulf between the way he lived and the way these Hebrew slaves toiled. As it began to gnaw at his soul, I suspect he averted his eyes because he did not want to have to face the hideous nature of slavery. When he could no longer ignore it, I suspect he did what many do. He started concocting rationalizations. Well, someone has to do the work, so why not the Hebrews? Slavery is part of the natural order. The Hebrew people are an inferior race. They're not nearly as intelligent as the Egyptians. Slavery benefits the Hebrew people. They're incapable of taking care of their own lives, so it's good that someone does it for them. Well, it'd be impossible to abolish slavery. The whole economy would have collapsed. Being a slave is better than starving to death. His justifications seem to build an impenetrable argument. However, over time, cracks began to appear in his logic. And then one day, all of those rationales collapsed in a filthy heap when he saw a taskmaster unmercifully beating a Hebrew slave. Moses just could not stomach such brutality. So he leapt on the taskmaster, killed him, and then began to worry. He buried the man in the sand. He hoped no one would know what was going on, but the very next day, word was starting to spread of what Moses had done. He knew it wouldn't be long before the news reached the ears of Pharaoh, so he ran for it. He traveled many miles away, settled in a land called Midian. In time, he married the daughter of the priest of Midian, and he settle down this very comfortable existence of tending the sheep of his father-in-law. But one day, this serene setting was disturbed by an intruder. The intruder was God. Our passage says, "The angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed." Perhaps it was literally a blazing bush from which Moses heard God's voice. Perhaps the blazes, the flames, were a dramatic touch added by a later generation. Perhaps it was a poetic reference to horrendous images of slavery that were blazing in Moses' mind and seared his conscience. However it happened, Moses heard God's call. Alone on the hills, quiet, calm, tending sheep, he had lots of time to think and reflect. During that time, Moses discerned that God was beckoning him to embrace a sacred but precarious mission. According to our text, God said, "I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come to deliver them from the Egyptians." Now, biblical scholars have noted that there are many parallels between Moses and Jesus. Moses and Jesus had so many parallels that the Gospel of Matthew actually presents Jesus as the new Moses. At the time of Moses, the Pharaoh ordered that all male Hebrew infants be killed. At the time of Jesus, King Herod ordered that all Hebrew infants be killed. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness. Jesus spent 40 days tempted in the wilderness. Moses delivered the law from a mountain. Jesus delivered the new law in terms of the Beatitudes from a mountain. Both Moses and Jesus revealed God as a loving creator who is deeply troubled by suffering and injustice. When people are in pain, God's heart aches. When people are treated unjustly, God rages. Both Moses and Jesus reveal God as a liberator of the oppressed. Prophetic spirituality, the kind of spirituality that Jesus and the prophets embraced, prompts us to feel compassion for those who suffer injustice. But we do not simply mourn for the victims. Prophetic spirituality ignites a passionate determination to do something, to chart a path that seeks liberty, dignity, and equality. Most of the time, I think the majority of us just ride along peacefully with the status quo. We are outraged the next time we hear about a mass shooting. We're outraged when we hear about one more sexual predator. We're outraged when immigrants are locked into cages, or an ugly incident targets someone strictly because of their race, their sexual orientation, their gender, or their religion. Yet, I think most of the time, that agitation we feel doesn't last very long because we turn our attention somewhere else so that we don't have to deal with that discomfort. Perhaps we think there's nothing we can do about it, so why let it upset us? Perhaps we want to avoid the hassle of throwing ourselves into a cause that simply seems to defy resolution. Perhaps we fear altering the comfortable groove into which we've settled. However, there come times when we cannot easily delete an awareness from our minds. Something distressing burrows its way into our conscience, and we simply cannot let it be. We are compelled to act. That prick of our conscience, that agitation in our soul to respond to injustice, I think that is the call of God. We constantly face options in life. God presents us with the best possibilities given our situation and urges us to respond in a way that promotes the common good. That urging, like a whisper in our soul or an emerging image in our mind, becomes less and less muffled the more we embrace prophetic spirituality. The more we picture the world as a beautiful, life-affirming place God envisions it can be, the more we feel compelled to work toward that vision. Now, the Presbyterian Church has a mixed history of being a prophetic voice on slavery. In 1818, more than 40 years before the Civil War, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church adopted the following resolution: we consider the voluntary enslaving of one part of the human race by another as a gross violation of the most precious and sacred rights of human nature and utterly inconsistent with the law of God. Further, that assembly called on Christians as speedily as possible to erase this blot on our holy religion. However, many pastors preached against slavery. They were run from their pulpits. They were driven from their towns. Numerous Presbyterians continued to own women, children, men, up until the end of the Civil War. And sadly, this legacy of slavery continues to haunt our nation up to this day. Like a stone that's tossed into the pond, the past sends out ripples that impact the present and the future. And this is certainly true of slavery in America. Although the Civil War was fought more than 150 years ago to end slavery, other cruel measures, such as refusing mortgages and voter suppression and mass incarceration, have been used to prevent African Americans from enjoying the same rights as white people. I've shared with you before that I grew up in Tulsa, and one of the classes I took in high school was Oklahoma history. Yet I did not learn until decades later about the fact that one of the worst and deadliest racial attacks in U.S. history occurred a few miles from my high school. That was never mentioned in my class, and there was no mention of it in my textbook. Did you know that between the 1870s and the Civil War, the World War I, African Americans established more than 100 all-black towns in the West in order to gain economic independence. And one of the most successful of these was in Tulsa, in this district called Greenwood. It had 30 restaurants. It had 45 groceries and meat markets. It had banks and dental offices and photography studios and dry goods stores. When World War I ended, black soldiers returned after serving our country in the war, hoping that there would be great progress in racial tensions. But in city after city, white mobs targeted black citizens and their businesses. On May 31st, 1921, a white mob descended on Greenwood in Tulsa. No one knows how many were murdered. Estimates range from 100 to 300. More than 1,400 homes and businesses were destroyed. A 35 square block area was completely demolished. 10,000 people were rendered homeless. And not one person was ever convicted of this racial violence. Today, the gap in wealth between whites and blacks is one of the most glaring legacies of slavery in America. Slavery ended when the Civil War concluded in 1865. Over the next 5 years, Reconstruction amendments established rights that gave African Americans equal protection under the law and the right to vote. In January of 1865, General William Sherman tried to right many of the wrongs of slavery by reallocating some of the land owned by slave owners to black families in 40-acre lots. But when Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson became the president. He rescinded Sherman's order by pardoning all the white plantation owners and returning the land to them. And then Johnson declared, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it will be a government for white men." Other measures were taken to restrain the progress of African Americans. There were lynchings, including one right here in Delaware in 1903. And the person most responsible for inciting the crowd to murder this young man was a popular Christian minister here in Wilmington. For more than a century following the Civil War, states enacted Jim Crow laws that were intended to suppress progress by African Americans and to keep black institutions separate and unequal. In our day, there's another measure being used to impede African Americans from ever enjoying all the same rights as whites: mass incarceration. Our country has the highest rate of incarceration of any country on the planet. We represent 4% of the planet's population, but 22% of the world's imprisoned. In the early 1970s, our prisons had 300,000 prisoners in them. Today, we have 2.2 million and another 4.5 million on probation or parole. Due to mandatory sentencing and 3 strikes laws, Delawarean Brian Stevenson has represented black men who were sentenced to life without parole for stealing a bicycle and for possessing marijuana. Life in prison. This practice of mass incarceration and excessive punishment is part of a legacy of slavery. Now, our selfish nature tempts us to turn away from all of this and to shield ourselves from this horrible pain and from the pain of other people. Our selfish nature tempts us to look for ways to get an advantage over others. Our selfish nature encourages us to divide the world between us and them. Jesus and the prophets make it crystal clear that our lives count for little if we fail to lift a burden, to alleviate suffering, and to speak out against injustice. Prophetic spirituality prompts us to examine our current situation in light of God's dream for the world, and then to lean hard into God's vision. And rather than begging God to clean up all the messes we create, prophetic spirituality infuses us with the determination and the daring to tackle things that are difficult. Because God wants us to become partners in healing our world.